Hello and welcome back to another discussion about a Hitchcock film. This time we're doing the 1939, I believe. Lady Vanishes, 37, 39, one of those years anyway. Definitely one of the last films that Hitchcock did in Britain before he moved over to America, where we talked about Rebecca last time. And we both loved Rebecca, heart and soul. Isn't that right, Jane?
We did, and now I feel bad because I have to break it to you, Chris. I did not love The Lady Vanishes. In fact, I really didn't like it. So we have the highs and lows of Hitchcock. As you said, we started off last time with Rebecca, which we both really enjoyed. It was such a
Yeah.
great story. And now I'm kind of interested to contrast that with something that maybe wasn't my favorite. So either way, I'm still excited to discuss The Lady Vanishes.
Yes, we haven't actually talked about what you didn't really like in it in any detail beforehand, because I think that's worth kind of getting into and talking about that. But like I said, it is worth saying, with this being produced not by a Hollywood producer, etc., and based directly off a novel that he was given as a script, because he was already sort of thinking about the Du Maurier novels at that time. Jamaica Inn and Rebecca, and those are the projects that he really wanted to do, and yet he found himself making Lady Vanishes at the time, while I suppose contracts were getting sorted out for those films that were coming up ahead. So I'll do a brief synopsis to start off with, and Lady Vanishes tells the story of a lady vanishing off a train. And we don't know why she's vanished, or if she even has vanished, is part of the whole thing as far as one of our main characters is concerned, because it's kind of questioned whether she's seen this person at all, and that sort of idea plays a lot through the film, and it goes here, there, and everywhere in terms of both what happens, but also in terms of reasons for that and why that might have happened, etc. That we'll investigate as I go through. But I'd like to start with the very, very start of the movie, because it's sort of like its own movie.
Yes, absolutely. One thing I did kind of appreciate is that we do get a real introduction to each and every character. So Hitchcock doesn't really spare any time with setting up the background of these characters, what role they're playing. And initially, that actually really interested me because I thought this was going to be such a character centric story. And I was so invested in these different types of stereotypes and these different caricatures and personas. So I actually think that was probably the best part of the story. And I think I went into it having this setup that it's about these characters in this hotel and how they're interacting. And it's totally different than that as we progress forward. But that's one thing that I actually did like, although it didn't save the story for me, unfortunately.
Yeah. Um, it is interesting because it is very, very comedic in tone and setting. You have this kind of made up language as well that kind of runs through it, which, according to the subtitles, is Bandrigan. Is actually what you call the language. Is sort of hodgepodge of Swedish, Italian, German. That's everything kind of put together, and it sort of gives it a no fixed location kind of feeling in terms of where it could be set or who it could be about, and I think that's sort of important some way when you consider the end of the movie and actually the time that it was filmed. Europe was under change at the time, and I'm always amazed by how on the nose a lot of the filmmaking was at the time around that, and especially in retrospect when everything that's happened and then we know happened after that. But that it starts at such a comedic tone with such serious sort of background is sort of interesting, and you're absolutely right, because we do spend 25 minutes of the movie getting to know the characters, which is so unusual, and especially because there's sort of equal billing given to all of the characters. Like, we have, by the end of the movie, a very strong male and female, you know, protagonists. But before that, we don't really see Michael Redgrave for a long part of the start of the film. We only see Margaret Lockwood's character a little bit at the start, but you don't even know she's the main character out of three women. There's a lot of time spent both with the hotel manager and especially with our lovely young men, uh, well, young might be the wrong word, but this rather odd couple of Charters and Culdrick, um, who were so popular from this movie, they ended up being paired up and started up in another 10 movies together. Sometimes as the same characters, and sometimes as similar characters or otherwise. But the film entirely starts with the lady who ends up vanishing, which is Miss Froy. She's walking through at the very start, and she's sort of interestingly shown to us at the start of the movie as being this prominent character, which we don't really know at the time. And the whole thing's really odd.
It is very odd. And even just the interactions between the characters, I thought was very bizarre in some cases. Like the whole like scenario between Iris and Gilbert, right as they're meeting, and there's whole like drama about the room, and he goes into her room and like camps out. And it's very bizarre. It's a little taken aback, like especially for today, like day and age. But I just thought like there's been such a heavy emphasis on like the kind of comedy aspect and the ridiculousness of it. So I thought going forward that that was going to kind of be the crux of the story. And so when we switch over to the train scene, I was a little jarred by it. So I think that's part of the reason why I didn't appreciate this film as much.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on the initial scenes with Gilbert and Aris on it because we've talked actually in the previous movies about especially the male characters. In each of the films that we talk about, Rebecca, Vertigo, and the Birds, as being all the men are sort of leery in the later the
Mhm.
American Hitchcock movies, all of them. And yet, I get the sense from this film that even though Michael Redgrave Gilbert's character goes into your room kind of weird, he's sort of portrayed as not leery. I don't know how you felt
Yeah.
about it. I thought it was a nice role
Yeah, I mean,
reversal and someone who's non-threatening.
granted, like for me, it was gonna be Leary anyway. Like the fact that a gentleman just enters a lady's room without her consent is gonna be Leary to me. Just that's how it is. But given like the persona and the interaction thereafter, it it wasn't it wasn't like downright creepy as it could have been. But I do think that it was almost again like played into a comedy aspect in a way that he just comes in and he makes himself at home and he's like moving her things and he's like, I'm going to tell everybody you invited me here. And it almost comes off as like flirtatious, but just for
Yes.
me, I didn't vibe with that. But I think that that was the tone that was intended to be, that it wasn't supposed to be threatening, more of
Mm-hmm.
a kind of like close quarters type of story, which again sets up for this train as well.
Yeah. Because I mean, his ultimate aim is just to get his damn room back. That's all he really wants of it. He makes this whole play about sleeping beside her and doing all that stuff, but ultimately he just wants his own room back. But I do think it's interesting in that it doesn't. It sort of makes the end of the movie not work for me in a lot of ways because there isn't that sense that these two are very attracted to each other at the stage, or that there
Yeah.
even would be at that stage. And I just, as usual, I felt that was unnecessary in a lot of ways. And I think some of the things that come out from that Michael Redgrave has talked about afterwards, one of the things he didn't like about doing movies is the fact that he basically turned up on the day, shot the scene. He never got to know Margaret Lockwood as a person beforehand to build any chemistry. And so the first scenes that they shot together were those scenes. And therefore he didn't like the fact that, it was his first introduction. He couldn't even have as much fun
Yeah.
as he could have done if they had a bit more repartee together. It just sort of felt a bit odd in that way. And at the start, he's presented as a bit more of a scoundrel than he actually is towards the end. I think his character shifts away from that comedic element, which I think is much to the detriment of the film. I think totally at the end.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. And I also think, though, a little tiny part of that interaction almost seems like a little bit of a class structure commentary to me as well. Because Iris kind of comes off as this higher class, like
Yes, she
she's
does.
almost like a debutante type, that she's getting married and she has all these like friends and she gets this beautiful room to herself and she gets her dinner in her room and she gets preferential treatment. And then when you kind of contrast that to Gilbert, like his room was not as fancy as hers was.
Yes.
It was the attic. It wasn't, it served its purpose, but it wasn't gilded in any way like her room was. I didn't see anybody serving him dinner. So in a way, him coming down and like kind of interrupting her like, bubble is a little bit kind of like making fun of her for her like higher class attitude,
Yeah.
which I think was kind of interesting. I did kind of wish that we saw more of that as the story went on because I think that's a really interesting concept to introduce in that way. But unfortunately, I didn't see as much evidence of it going.
Yeah, it meant that by the time they sort of got together by the end of the film, you didn't see the movement in it because I totally agree with you. That is represented as a class difference very prominently at the start and very much as that. And I don't feel like they would have actually naturally went together, regardless of all the high stress and drama that went afterwards. I didn't really feel that there was enough in that because they didn't put enough time into it. There's only a couple of scenes which we'll probably touch on here and there throughout that, but like apart from the fact he's playing the clarinet all wrong, I'm just going to put that out there. And he's playing it upside down. That bothered me no end. But anyway, we had that. Then you have to contrast that with our two this this couple men who really don't play any
Oh,
function in the film other than to be bystanders and observers until the very end scene that we get to in which they kind of step up. But all the rest of the time, all they're really interested in is cricket, as it turns out. Um, and it's sort of a weird thing because you sort of expect that it is a representation of a gay couple, but it's really not. There's nothing actually suggests, even when they're sort of in bed together and one of them's top half naked and the other one isn't, and the maid keeps coming in and out of the room, they just get on like two little schoolboys that they've known each other all their life, kind of thing, without there really being an indication that there's anything more going on. Which sort of play with my memory because I've seen this multiple times, and I sort of had it in my head that they were a representation of a gay couple in 1939, but I don't think they really were. It was just more comedic double act.
I think I think there may have been. I think that might have been alluded to by Hitchcock.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, 1938 may not have had the like communication style that we do
Yeah.
today um, to talk about that. But I actually saw them that they were kind of like the comedic relief a little bit. Like they were, these two that were just so excited about the cricket match, and like they were almost bothering like everybody else, like with the sugar and with well, I'm not going to miss the cricket match. We have to lie, and so it's almost like they played that comedic relief for the more suspenseful scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And also just the whole scene where they are like in the maid's room and that just it's kind of started them off that these are characters that you're not taking too seriously, like they're not going to
Yes.
be threatening in any way, or they're not going to be the villain, or they're not going to be the perpetrators of the missing woman. So I did like their characters. I found them very very interesting, and I liked how they played off of each other acting as well.
It's interesting because I think the feeling at the time when it was released, because again it was a British film, like they would be very funny and recognizable to British audiences, but actually the American audiences didn't get their style of humor then. And I wonder how much because of the
Yeah,
passage of time and the bleeding of those two comedic cultures into each other, both the American and the Britain and Britain and the America, has made it a much more recognizable form of comedy, in terms of being that,
I
just
think
being
you're
very
right.
straight backed English, very, not worried about world affairs. That's not thing just fascinated over small things like tea or sugar or cricket, as the case may be. So that was nice and interesting. Sorry, one other thing I meant to say about the Iris Lockwood and their characters is there's a scene where they're in the hotel room and they are in nightgowns or something when they're down, they're showing a bit of leg. So it is intimated that actually Hitchcock put that in, or that was put in because they couldn't have got away with it in America at the time because of the Hays Code. They were showing too much
Really?
skin, and it would have been that scene
Yes.
either would have had to be cut or the film banned because it sort of contrasts the difference between British films at that time and the American films at that time and what they can get away with. And certainly by today's standards, I mean, they're literally
Yeah,
showing
it's
a bit of
something.
leg in their nightgowns or something. But it was seen as very risque at the time, and also the stuff with the maid, as she's sort of being very suggestive, coming in and out of the room and in the drawers, and there's nothing happening there.
And the
So that whole
innuendos, and yeah.
yes, loads of that, and again, all
Mhm.
done for comedic effect rather than necessarily moving the plot forward. In fact, the only thing that happens in the hotel which sort of propels the plot is the scenes with Miss Froy, then, who's at the window and the singing downstairs, and the guy playing and her listening. That's the only indication I think we get of plot, which is this is really unusual for a Hitchcock film. Usually, you set things up a lot more than that.
I agree, and that actually went over my head the first time I watched this. I watched this twice. Watched it again after I knew the reveal, and so I could look back and see the significance of these scenes. And that actually, it was so subtle that it went over my head because I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't understand why the serenader or the man singing was, strangled all of a sudden. Now I do. But it was just so delicately done and so underhanded and so subtle that I was questioning myself. Like at the beginning, I'm like, why are we watching 10 minutes of singing? So yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting. And looking back, it does kind of signify the importance that Miss Froy had later on. Um, but then again, you have to go through the story to realize that.
Yeah, and especially at that point, we know that the film's called The Lady Vanishes, and I'm sure when people watched this in cinema at the time, they were like, right, we don't even know which lady's vanishing at this stage because there are two very prominent female parts here, and it could be either. In fact, I think you sort of assume that it's going to be Aris that's the one
I
that's
I
going to go
did too.
missing,
I did
and
too.
going through it, and when that kind of the rugs pulled out from underneath you at that stage. But you bring up the music, and especially about the serenade at the window. So one of the key things that Hitchcock wanted to do in this was that there would only be music at the start and the end, and any other music in between was going to be generated as part of the story, so that the points of the melody, etc., would be memorable or might have a chance of standing out,
Oh,
and that he wanted to communicate that the noise of the train was ever present throughout the time that they were on the train.
oh,
Um,
that's right.
the, so that was going to be part of the soundtrack with the big background noise of that, which is, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I've watched this lots of times, this film. It still blows my mind when I watch the bit when they're on the train and realize that they were never on a train. None of this was filmed on a train.
That
Zero.
actually makes sense because it would be so tight that you wouldn't be able to, at the time, you wouldn't be able to have all of the camera equipment because it was probably
Yeah.
so bulky. That actually makes a lot of sense. But the set
Not.
design is incredible then.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. So they do a lot of rear projection, especially in the scenes where he's hanging out the window and looking around. There's like a bit in the foreground, which is obviously the set, and then it's rear projection after it. Some of the scenes and the technical ability is just off the charts. But the bit that really blows my mind about the communicating as a train is the slight rocking that they do with the camera.
Yeah.
It's unreal. Like I haven't watched it multiple times and went back and watched it now. You go like it is unbelievable that they aren't actually on a train here. That somebody moved the camera, and those days those cameras were enormous. Like it wasn't just like somebody doing hand
Yeah.
steady cam and stuff. Now it was those things were enormous. Like it is unbelievable that was not filmed on a train, but yeah, they communicate it so effectively and on what is probably a very low budget film as it was at the time. There
Oh,
was no
absolutely.
real no real money spent in it. One last thing I sort of want to say about the casting before we move on, and you can certainly bring up anything else that's on there. I think it was interesting because again we've been talking about Rebecca, we've been talking about the Birds, and we've been talking about Vertigo, and each of them has a very strong female character, and as this does as well. But this one feels actually a bit more like the male is the star in it a little bit compared to say the Birds, for instance, which is very Tippy Hedren, as the main star. Um, Vertigo is Kim Novak is absolutely the star. It's got Cary Grant in it, but she's the dynamite on the screen. I don't know. The British films have a much more sense of being male leads. And now this one definitely has the balance between the two of them compared to say something like 39
Mhm.
Steps or something like The Man Who Knew Too Much or something before that, where it's about leading men. But it's funny how that starts to shift around this time for Hitchcock, where it became very much about the central female performances being the real driver for it. I don't know if you agree with it, with any of what I've said, especially about Vertigo, because like it does have Cary Grant in it, so he's a pretty prominent leading man, and Jim Stewart was in a lot of them as well, very prominent. But it's the females for most of those films that are the really key parts of cast. And like we talked again about Rebecca, about how they fought over who was actually going to act as, our unnamed uh, wife, as it was, and they didn't. They had Laurence Olivier as a very prominent leading man, but also just kind of a nothing character in some ways. In a lot of the same ways as Cary Grant's a sort of nothing character in Vertigo. In some ways, there's not really much character development with him, whereas there is with Kim Novak.
So I have to disagree slightly. With The Lady Vanishes, I do see that Iris is the main character. Like everything's happening within Iris's head. And I think that's the main difference.
Hmm.
Is that we're seeing all this thought process, you're seeing all this questioning within herself. And I think that's a very different perspective than his other films, where
Mm-hmm.
things outside are happening to the characters, they're responding,
Yes.
rather than we seeing her going through a process. So I personally think that I actually got a little bit more that Iris was the star of the show, a little
Okay.
bit more than the other Hitchcocks, for this very reason. Now, granted, we can say with Rebecca that may not apply, but especially when you compare it to something like Vertigo, like I see that we're actually more in James Stewart's mindset here. So
Oh, I take
again,
Cary
and
Grant,
it's
but
all of these events. That's okay. I was wondering. I was like, is Cary Grant in that? Did I miss that? I gotta watch
no,
it
it's not.
again.
It is Jimmy Stewart, of course. It is. Rear Wind,
That's
or not
okay.
Rear
That's
Window,
okay.
North by Northwest, kind of, because it came to mind so much when we
That's
were
right.
watching Lily Vanishes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I think that it was a different setup for me. So I do think that in The Lady Vanishes, Iris was way more central than all the other
Mm.
Hitchcocks, for the reason that all the other female leads, they're responding to outside influences. We're not seeing them actually absorb anything there.
Okay.
We and with Vertigo, I do think it's more about Jimmy Stewart's character and less about Kim Novak's experience and her thought processes. Maybe a little bit towards the middle, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it's more about what's happening and James Stewart's character's mind. So I think there are slight differences. I actually got a little bit more interested that we were like with Iris from beginning to end in all of this, and I don't
Yes.
always see that with the others.
It's interesting because in all those films that we've talked about, I suppose the birds is through Tiffy Hedren's head as well. These characters don't change; they're just the windows through which we view the story. If you know what I mean, Jimmy Stewart's character doesn't really change. He's sort of caught in this drive of solving the mystery, but he's just the cop. Same here, Aris. Her character doesn't really change aside from her falling for Gilbert at the end, which again I'm not sure really works in the terms of that. Whereas I don't know, maybe it's worth doing a rewatch of all of those films again to see. But I do think his characterization is interesting about where he what he decides to do with his characters, especially like this. This is the shortest film of all three that or all four that we've watched now by a long way, and I would sort of say it's maybe 20 minutes too long, 25 minutes too long. It could have been done
Yeah,
in a lot shorter time. But that he spends that time building characters at the start is so not Hitchcock for what he did afterwards, and certainly later on in his career. And I think that's quite notable.
I completely agree. And that was one thing that my first watch, I was actually checking my watch and I was like, how long is this going to go? Like, I totally agree that it felt, and then I watched it again. I was like, is this really only an hour and 30 minutes? But it felt much longer to me, like much longer. Like I could have sworn it was over 2 hours in my brain. And I think that's also part of the reason why I didn't like it as much because, again, it felt like two to three different stories crammed into
Mm-hmm.
one. And it felt like there's a lot more, like you had to go back and reset up and like kind of shift your thinking. And it felt like a lot of work for me
Yeah,
personally. So I think that it's funny that you said that too, because that was a thought in my mind as well that it was too long.
yeah, definitely disjointed in terms of tonally. Those sections of the movie definitely jumped out at me this time. We'll move on to the train bit, which is the main part of the film. I'd say about 50 minutes, 55 minutes in the middle. The mystery element of it, the setting up. We have, obviously, Aris gets hit over the head for that was supposed to hit Miss Foray over the head and all of that kind of stuff. So she's suffering the ill effects of that. And we get a tea car scene that, I mean, this is one of the things I really like about the movie. I think this is really interesting. Hitchcock sort of plays with the fact that people think they're going to watch a Hitchcock movie. Even at those days before um, it hit America, he was known for doing certain things in his film, and he sort of plays a couple of times throughout the film of saying, "Here's something that you think is going to be really important as a viewer that isn't." That isn't. So he has that suspense of like when she writes Floy on the window, and we even see it later. We think, aha, this is the big thing that's going to come back later, and then it comes back later, and it's like, but it's not really a thing. And they do it with the glasses and the poison and the wine later on. But again, this idea that you give the viewer insight into what's happening that not all characters are going to be aware of later on, and you think, oh, I bet I've seen that, and I noticed that it's really important. But he calls a double bluff on you because those aren't the key bits of information in it, and I think that's some of the stuff that I really like because it builds an apprehension and a suspense that he doesn't totally pay off for you, and it's almost like he's having a little laugh and going, "Thought it was going to be that easy," or
Yeah.
something to
It's
that
like he's
effect.
playing jokes on the viewer.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, it's definitely like he's playing jokes on the viewer. And that is kind of like his humor. Like if you look at a lot of like the promos he did for other films, like
Yes.
he has a very, very unique sense of humor. And so you do see a little bit like of ribbons of that with the situations that you were describing. So that is kind of classic Hitchcock. Like he has a very odd sense of humor sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, Something that I thought was really kind of interesting is that this is where we see Iris's turmoil, like the majority of the turmoil, obviously because her friend's missing. And I think there's a really, really great theme of like gaslighting and about like this idea that can she be relied on? Can she not? What's going on? And even to the point where the viewer's like, yeah, what is going on anyway? Um, so I think that was a really interesting theme to talk about. And I do think, unfortunately, that was partially gendered as well, because
Okay.
you
Yeah.
kind of see her being like, she's a younger lady, she's going to be married. Like, this is like kind of her stage in life. And everyone's so dismissive of everything she knows she's sure of, but she's almost written off as like a hysterical woman because of the
Yeah.
condition. So I thought that was kind of interesting that, again, I don't think it was as clear cut or as meaningful, unfortunately, as it could have been within the story. But that is something that kind of kept me within this train scene as well.
Yeah.
She was going
I,
through that process.
I hadn't thought of it like the strike of one, but as soon as you started on that path, it had come to in my head as well that she was easily dismissed, which is why I think in some ways Michael Redgrave's character Gilbert gets a free pass for being the only person to see through that, if you know what I mean, or at least I don't even think he does. I think he just sort of humors her for a while, and then kind of comes to the stage once he sees the tea packet getting thrown out the window of actually to say, oh, actually, she might be telling the truth, rather than actually believing her
Yeah,
all along. That
right.
is interesting. I wonder how much the temptation was to actually show less of Miss Froy at the start, and actually have the viewer wonder whether it was all in her head. The
Yeah,
actually to
I think
really
it
play
would
on
be a
that.
little bit. Yeah, I think it would have been a stronger story for it, more of like a psychological thriller.
Yeah,
Um, because then again, it's you kind of knew like, well, she either ended up killed off the train or she's somewhere on the train, and so for me, it didn't like give a lot of space to wonder and like theorize or anything like that because there seemed to really only be two options.
yeah,
Um, but I like that idea better that maybe kind of more of an elusive character or almost ghost-like in a way.
yeah,
Um, I think that for me would have been way more effective. I like that idea.
yeah. It's very reminiscent, like a film that is very like that. You've probably never seen, but I would recommend is Bonnie Lake is Missing from the late 60s, early 70s, something like that, where a woman's daughter goes missing, but similarly, you don't really see the daughter. You know, did she go missing? Is this going ahead? It's a really effective movie by Otto Preminger. I'm pretty sure that it's a great movie. I recommend it. But it plays on that same idea, but it definitely goes further down the road into saying, well, actually, is this character real, or actually what's going on in this story? Whereas in, like you say, in this story, it's very much more about, we've seen her so often. She is real, and we've got to work out, well, why is everybody lying or saying they haven't seen her? Like, is everybody? It seems unlikely that everybody's in on this at the time, but if they are, then what the hell's going on? Like, it's not. It doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense, and some might argue that it still doesn't come the end of the film, um, but it kind of robs some of the suspense, I think, from the film because of that.
I agree. And I actually think that this one gave me a lot of similar feelings to the Orient Express, and it
Yes.
has a very, very similar kind of feeling to it where, nobody's talking about what happened on the train. No one could have possibly done it. And again, there's a lot of gaslighting in that story as well. So I actually kind of saw it that they were extremely similar. So I think that
Yeah.
also took a little bit away from like the novelty of a story like this for me. Um, yeah. Otherwise than that, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's sort of I don't know. I definitely felt while watching it. It's one where I felt the length when you can feel the resolution coming up, and then you look and go, there's about half an hour to go in this film. What the hell's going to happen? And you certainly get to the point that, like, I didn't work out what was going on. Certainly, I don't think there was enough clues in that. I sort of had those moments where Hitchcock played with us. Certainly with the letters written in the window, etc. And then he sort of distracts us for a while when they do go searching for him with the Hitchcock and Watson scene again. Back to a bit of the comedy aspect of the game where they're back in the
Mm,
car, start to find the goat, and then he puts on the deerstalker cap, and then they have the disappearing person cabinet. The fact that they throw in that he's a traveling magician, you think that's sort of related, but I mean,
yeah.
again, these are all red herrings again that are coming on, and because I think because all of that doesn't come to anything, it feels unfulfilling. I think by the end of it.
Yeah. I definitely agree too, because there were a lot of really great setups. And this is something that I see with a lot of books as well, that
Mhm.
sometimes authors will do such great setups and they'll do like almost too many red herrings. So the reader and or the viewer gets a little frustrated. And then when you do get like the payoff, it's actually very underwhelming compared to
Yeah,
some of these scenarios that they could have went with. So
yeah. The revelation about the nun wearing high heels quite clever because we don't actually see an awful lot of it. It's very clip glance, but the fact that she would turn so quickly is a bit odd.
yeah.
In terms of become she actually is the hero of the entire movie, as it turns out, and she does the signal change and all at the end, in terms of helping them out. But it does again create another one of the scenarios where we think our two heroes are in danger, and that the guy has outsmarted them, the evil guy has outsmarted them, and it creates again a bit of false peril again because they never actually were in that much peril, and again that feels sort of cheap, um, in some
Yep,
way.
I agree.
But
Something, oh, sorry, Chris.
I was just gonna say, but there's something about this film I really like, and I think it might be just Michael Redgrave and Margaret Lockwood. I think even though they're not believable as a couple, they're both entirely convincing as likable people, smart, likable people. Like they both sort of, for different reasons, he is seen as being a bit more dumb than he is. He's obviously a very capable, smart man, but because of his class, he is seen maybe in a different light, and also because of her class, she's seen as maybe not as capable and
Mm,
smart in her way. So it's sort of like this bit in the middle was where they would have to meet, and there's something about that. It's pretty much what you said at the start. If they had have done more with that, I think this would have been a lot more of an interesting movie and removed some of the start and some of the end and actually spent more time actually developing those two characters and about proving how smart they were or how people were taking them seriously or talked about their backgrounds or something like that. Who Charles was, because we only get to see Charles the fiance to be at the very, very end, and we make a snap judgment call of him, the way he's dressed, etc. But we could have investigated all
Just
that
nope.
and given some credence to their relationship. Because if she had described actually what man he was kind of like, you might have went, well, actually, then he's a very good fit. But we got none of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that you say they're likable. I actually found that 90% of the characters in the story were unlikable. And I did actually have that feeling with Gilbert's character at first. Like the whole, like, I'm going to be honest, the whole sneaking in her room thing just put me off a lot. So there's no coming back from that, to be honest with me. And
Red
even,
flags everywhere.
and even, yeah, right, the red flags. And even with Iris, you know, she did kind of come off as soon as kind of this like spoiled little rich girl
Mm-hmm.
type of thing. So it's kind of interesting. I appreciate that you were more connected with them, but
Yeah.
for me, like they were just like the center of, and the rest of the cast, except for Miss Froy, I did like Miss Froy a little bit. The rest of the cast were just so unlikable that I'm just like, do we really care what happened on this train, really? But so yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting. Is that each one for me just had drawbacks. Like there wasn't one character I was truly invested in. Even Miss Froy, to be honest, even though I liked her more than I disliked the other characters, it still wasn't a like immediate connection.
First person in history to ever be hating on our two cricket lovers characters, Charters and Caldecott.
True, true.
So
Guess
they're
I'll
so
just take
beloved. I
that
think I
one.
can see why they spawn so many kind of guest appearances as a double act going through, especially because like he has a scar, and you know he's quite an older man, and he's a younger man. You know, it's a weird, odd couple, so to speak. But
Yeah,
yeah, it's interesting. Is there anything
I
else
don't know. I think
about the
it's
train
just
sequence, sir? Sorry.
well. I think it's also just the idea that like you're putting cricket over finding a missing woman. You know what I mean? I think for me that doesn't bode well. I mean, again, I like them very much as comedic characters. You know, I think they added a lot to the story, but like that choice just for me kind of jarred me a little bit. And the fact that like every single character put like their self interest over what was ever happening to this older lady, it was a big problem for me. Like we had the couple with the affair that didn't want to get caught. Okay, I can understand that maybe a little bit, not really. But then you have like, well, I can't miss the cricket match. It's funny, but at the same time, it's really not. So yeah, I had a mixed reaction with all of these
I
characters.
think what's funny about that is I actually think that's Hitchcock's commentary on English culture, especially those two characters. English
Maybe.
people, oh God, how to say this without sounding condescending, but they worry about things like tea, weather, sports, things like that. Things that are massively important are way down the line for British people. Like it's just it is something that's odd, and I think like the bit that he makes later on when they were saying, "Oh, what are we going to do?" and they say, "We'll go to the tea car because all the English people have tea at this time, and that's really important to them." Again, is Hitchcock sort of making a commentary on English lifestyle, I think, and in the things that are sort of important. Like you can see how put out he's been very ingenious with the sugar and kind of illustrating the cricket and how it's going with Wally Hammond and all that kind of stuff, and the inconvenience that somebody else even needs the sugar for their tea is like, oh, what? And it's, again, this very spoiled British ideal of, you know, I was doing something that was important to me, and the outside world doesn't really matter. Like even like back to the hotel when they interrupted the phone call, they asked about the cricket, and as soon as that happened, they hung up the phone, and rather than go, oh God, somebody's making that phone call, they go, oh well, it doesn't matter. Let's just go on and walk on. So
Okay. So maybe I just missed the context there. So that could be very, very true, but I just missed it.
I mean, I could be wrong, but it did feel very much that he was sort of making a point in a couple of places about English nature, and also with the fact that the nun at the end, the fact that actually at the end of it, once she found out that they were English as well, all of her other allegiances went out the window because you do the right thing, you know, and especially we're all in this together at that stage, which I think sort of play it into that uh, as well, and it sort of feels like the film wraps up once they switch the bodies and
Yeah.
and then move on, and then we get
Which,
this
by the
coda.
way,
You go.
sorry. Which, by the way, maybe like I just it went over my head, but the technicalities of what actually happened also was a little bit like hard for me to follow. Like in my understanding, and maybe this is totally wrong. My understanding is that they brought somebody wrapped up in a sheet on board. It was probably Miss Kemmer.
Summer.
Was that her
Yeah,
name?
yeah.
Kemmer. They switched
Comer.
her with Miss Froy.
Mm-hmm.
Kemmer, yep. And then they were going to take Miss Froy out, but that means Miss Froy had to be somewhere in the train, just knocked out somewhere. See what I mean? It's just there were so many like little spiderweb pieces of technicality in this that I didn't. It went over my head in a way.
You're forgetting this was actually a movie.
What?
This was actually
Well,
a movie.
true,
This
true.
was not real life. I think actually
Okay,
Hitchcock
fair
talks.
enough. Maybe I just read too much true crime. Okay, maybe
I,
that's it.
I do think this is a modern conceit, especially because there's so many procedurals etc. on TV that if they don't make a
Yeah.
proper sense, people pick holes in them. But Hitchcock actually talked about this. He says he was never really interested in making sure there were no loose ends. It was always about the journey of watching the film and actually making things that worked within a film context rather than kind of going, oh, well, that would have taken too much time or otherwise. So, but I think by modern standards, you wouldn't get away with it now at all. People would just say this didn't work
Yeah.
at all. I've just done a spoiler cast for
Yeah.
season 4 of True Detective, and the way that was pulled apart was on another level. Like it was just wow. Okay, that's where we're going with this kind of thing. So like you're not wrong in the fact that like the practicalities of all that stuff were ridiculous. Even how he noticed it wasn't Miss Froy seemed stretching credulity. Even everything,
Yeah.
the fact that they would only ask the people on the cart who had their own issues. Like there must have been hundreds of people on the cart that had seen Miss Froy. The other people would have seen her. So it does all kind of mean that you have to just kind of think, oh, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether that was exactly
Okay. All
the
right.
right
Good
thing or not.
reminder, Chris. Good reminder.
Yeah, I have
Um.
this conversation with my wife all the time, in terms of she would turn around and go, "Can you believe that actually happened in a TV show? Yeah, it's stunning. It's or in a movie. That's I can't believe that happened. That's really, really something else." Sorry, go ahead.
That's fair enough. No, that's fair enough. And again, like I read a lot of like true crime and things like that, and like
Yeah,
audiobooks, and so like things have to like follow a certain like process for me to like follow. It just kind of felt to me like, oh, she's wrapped up in a body cast. And it's like, okay, well, how'd she get in the body cast?
yeah,
So it just kind of felt like more surprising for me and just a little less satisfactory
yeah.
than seeing like maybe the behind the scenes because like we saw that like with Vertigo, I believe. Yeah, we saw that with Vertigo. Like they went back and they showed, oh, this is actually what happened. This is
Yeah.
like who took her. This is, how she set up everything with Scotty. And so then the audience gets that satisfaction with that knowing. Um,
Hmm.
but I didn't get this with Lady Vanishes. So.
Yeah. You make me like this film less and less as we get through it. But anyway.
Don't let me take that joy away from you, Chris.
No,
Don't
I
let me
mean
take the joy
what I
away
like
from
about the movie is sort of slight anyway. I sort of do like the Britishness of it. Like there is a recognizable kind of
you.
aspect to it, and I like the technical stuff a lot. Again, I keep coming back to the fact I can't believe this wasn't actually shot any of it on a train. Like that just kind of blows my mind. I even really like the made up uh, European language that everybody seems to speak.
Mm.
It's dumb as all hell. It's a little bit racist, but it sort of makes me laugh a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's one of those
yeah.
things. I, I have the coda, which wasn't in the original book that it was adapted from. They stuck it on for, I don't know, to lengthen the film. I think that must have been the only thing that I can think of. It doesn't work. None of it.
No,
Separating the train cars off
really?
and having the shootout and them escaping and her running out the back and escaping, and then the moronic scene at the end where they walk into the foreign office and she's playing the piano, comes and hugs them. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know.
One thing I did like, and I chuckled a little bit, was when one of the cricket gentlemen were coming out, and he was like just gonna like do his thing, and then he gets shot in the hand.
Yes.
And then he just kind of looks and he's like, "Oh, look at that!" I thought that was hilarious. It was like I could see the humor in that. I thought that was pretty fun. Um, so that was one thing that I'm just like, okay, like I can see Hitchcock's sense of humor here and his like commentary on the like you know
Yeah.
mindset of that character. So I
I have
thought
to
that
say,
was kind of fun.
I was glad that at least those two characters had some reason to be in the story, at least at that point, because they weren't in the book,
Mm.
apparently. And that they actually had some expositional part to stay in the story and give me a reason why they might have or could have survived, if you know what I mean. The fact that Michael Redgrave can play clarinet and drive a train because he watched somebody start it up seems a bit, again, are you sure? Are you sure that's the thing? No, okay.
It's a movie, Chris.
It's a
It's a
movie,
movie, Chris.
but I
You're
go with it,
forgetting
it's
it's a
fine.
movie.
And the fact that, love distracted him remembering the tune. He'd done nothing but whistle it and hum it for 2 days, and then as soon as he had a kiss, it was all gone. He could only think of the wedding march,
Yep.
and I was like, "Oh my
Memory
god,
wiped.
memory wiped." And yet to hear playing the piano, and I wish we could scrub the end part of that movie because I'm not a fan
Yeah.
of it at all. In
Yeah.
fact, I keep on forgetting it's
I
there.
didn't like the whole I didn't like from the like shootout onward, I feel like it just didn't really work. Like I personally felt like it could have ended with like we found Miss Freud, this is what's actually going on, and she makes her escape. And
Yeah,
even just leaving it on a cliffhanger like that, like did she make it? Did she not? Like that would have been, I think, so much more satisfying than like, well, no, now it's your job to carry this secret mission song, and if you forget it, there's a dire consequence. And I'm just like, he, like granted he's a musician, but I'm just like, don't give me like a secret mission with government secrets that could destroy the world. Don't do that. Like, so I'm just on a train ride. So
I think you'd be really good.
that's maybe to be honest, probably yeah. But but I think that from there on out, and then like it just gets more ridiculous. Like the shootouts, they weren't gonna survive that train. Like if the government comes for your train car, you're done. And then the whole like we're gonna go see like carry this out, and Miss Roy just happens to be there, and they're playing the piano. It's so bizarre because to me it's like, are they best friends with like an international spy now? Is that like, do they have tea and swap international secrets? Like it just was so ridiculous that I was just like, I can't with this
It's even the fact that she was an international spy. I mean, it sort
movie.
of
Yeah,
it only came to that. It just seemed to get progressively worse. It was like she was a governess and spotted something and needed to report it back to them being a spy, and it just seemed to get more and more ridiculous as it went on. And then the fact that they just happened to run into each other, I don't know. It just although having said that, when you seen her running out the back of the train and then diving off the end of the ditch, like that was impressive. That woman could shift.
she's doing her calisthenics.
Yeah, she's been doing her training. Well, obviously, whatever whatever was happening with her. Did you spot
Yeah, she did
Hitchcock in
great.
the film? Did you spot the cameo?
No, I didn't. I
Oh,
think I know like somewhere where it is, but I don't. I didn't. I
so
think
it's
it's somewhere where they're either getting on the train or off the
yeah,
train,
it's
but
at the train station at the
I didn't
end,
see it.
at the very end when they're running through and
Oh,
looking for Charles and doing whatever. So you can keep an eye out for that. He is in it at that stage, and if you can't find it, I'll send you a screenshot because
all right, we'll do.
he
Um,
is in it
yeah,
there.
that's one thing I actually really like that he did with all of his films, and I heard that he actually started doing it like earlier in the films because everybody was not watching; they were just watching to see what he
For him.
missed,
Yeah,
and so then they couldn't like criticize or like talk about the film because they weren't actually watching it; they were just trying to see Hitchcock, and so that's kind of why he started it like with the first couple frames, like in the birds.
that's right.
So I thought that was kind of fun and pretty clever as well. So
I
that's
mean,
one
you
thing
can
that I love that he did with all
yeah,
of
you can
his.
see that it happens modern days, like when Stan Lee was in all of the Marvel movies. I mean, people were looking out for that as well, and in pretty much exactly the same way. Um, in those, so it is a thing that it does become distracting, especially when you go through it. Like even South Park, I had to stop Kenny getting killed every episode because that was getting distracting for
I
that
think
as well.
Stephen King did. I think Stephen King did one with the remake of it, like the second one of it.
I refuse to watch the remake
The
of it.
bikes,
Is
yeah.
it any good? I hear it's good.
The first one is with the kids. Like that one was fun. That was they did such a great job. The second one, not so much because the adults took it over and lost a little bit of that joy. But
The second
it was
half
fun
of
to see Stephen King in it.
the second half of the book's not great either. Well,
No, that's
I'm
true.
not saying it's not
I can
great,
I
but
can make it past the third. That'll be another discussion. Maybe we'll
yeah,
discuss that on like my channel or something like that. We're getting off topic.
damn, we have to
But
discuss it.
um
Damn.
so yeah, I think that if you we chopped it off and we just had Miss Roy like make her get away and like the reveal like she's a
Yeah,
spy and she's off like to give this government secrets through a song and like and you don't know whether she got shot or
yeah,
not at the end. That would have been so much more
that would have been
interesting
cool.
because then you can discuss that. You can but then they just kind of like kept that runtime going. So
I wonder how important it was again because of the timing of it in 38 or so that it did have a resolution. That it was important that the I mean, because it's sort of like it is and it isn't.
oh
It's sort of
yeah, it makes
indicated that
sense
the baddies are the
historically.
Germans here in this movies, but they obviously couldn't say that. But it's sort of indicated, and I wonder how much the fact that that end was tacked on because it was important for national morale at that stage
Yeah,
that the secret was delivered, and I
yeah,
think those parts are interesting to discover and dive into.
that's a fair assessment as well. Because again, this is 1938, so that would be more important as well. Because that's
Yeah,
what media served back in that time.
that's
It
right.
still does.
Well, a lot of British filmmaking went from 1940 onwards, etc., into propaganda making. It was all about glamorizing the war so that they get more people to sign up and enlist and do all that stuff. Even Paul and Pressburger were making like One My Aircraft Is Missing as a propaganda film. It's a brilliant propaganda film, but it was very much about, you know, let's all band together and do our part and do all that kind of stuff. And you could be a hero too. All that. Anything else about The Lady Vanishes?
Well, I do think also it is a movie of its time, a little
Yes.
bit. And I think that storytelling was very different back then when film was kind of more in its elementary stage than it is now. Because now that's I think a lot more goes into like filmmaking and writing and things like that because audiences have evolved as well. So I think that maybe part of the reason I don't like it is just because it was probably a great film at its time,
Mm,
but just the audiences have changed a little bit. I'm
yeah.
part of that. So I don't think it's a bad film, but I think that for me, I couldn't appreciate it as much as it probably should have
One of the things I was sort of interested in kind of pushing this one, especially is not a very early Hitchcock, but a slightly earlier one, is whether, regardless of whether you like the film or not, whether you kind of start to look for the Hitchcockian tricks because he's very famous for being a clever filmmaker, certainly way ahead of his time in
been.
terms of being and using the camera in certain ways and using tricks, etc. Whether that's enough for me, it usually is. Like I don't describe the idea that the Hitchcock's the greatest filmmaker of all time. I definitely don't think he was because he was making a type of movie. If you know what I mean, he was looking to entertain people in the cinema. That was his thing. A lot of his films don't really stand up to acute analysis of whether something could work or otherwise. Maybe apart from his most famous ones, which he is rightly lauded for, but actually as a body of work, he was much more interested in selling tickets at at a box office or at a
Mhm.
cinema and getting people to go and get excited for a new Hitchcock movie because you knew what you were going to get, being very much of its time. So I wonder as we make our way through, especially to see films that I haven't seen, you know, from Zuber that aren't as famous, say for instance, whether whether it's enough just to see the Hitchcockian parts of it, kind of, and seeing what he did with some of that, and whether that kind of will pull me through a film that I just kind of thought was fair to middling, as they would say here.
Mhm. I definitely agree, and I think that you can appreciate both. So even if you do, like for me, I don't appreciate the story as much. I
Yeah,
can appreciate the elements of Hitchcock and the humor and the characterization. So I don't think it has to be zero sum. I think that you can take bits and pieces, and
yeah,
that's what makes these films so fun.
yeah. So that's The Lady Vanishes. Hitchcock's screwball comedy, as it turns out. Who knew?
Now, Chris, how would you rate this? Because we've been doing this thing where we're tier rating all the Hitchcock. So I gotta know.
I
I forget
mean,
all the. Granted, I forget all the ones that we've actually watched. So.
so we've only watched three other ones apart from this. Of when, and this is about revisiting. So as we make our way through this, there will be ones that you'll have seen, the ones that I've seen beforehand, and we kind of do it. This is definitely out of the four films that we've done. This is definitely the lowest of the four, and I like it quite a lot more than you. There's no doubt it's not on the level of Rebecca was my top. I think Vertigo was second. Birds was third. I think, although the gap between Vertigo and Birds is quite short, I think for me compared to maybe your otherwise, this is a long way forth, without doubt. In that, even though I still enjoy it quite a bit, and obviously it's going to be your number four, I assume.
Yes, it's way down the list. It's under the birds, to be honest. And I did not like the birds. But again, it's not necessarily a bad film.
Yeah,
It's just there were a lot of elements that, for me, didn't translate as well as probably modern filmmaking has now.
yeah,
So I do keep that in mind with my rating. But unfortunately, I just think the other ones, even the birds, were stronger.
yeah.
But then again, he's developing as a filmmaker as you're going through as well. So there
Absolutely,
there are
yeah.
differences because he has more experience, he has more technical expertise, technology's changing, storytelling's changing. So I think for the time it was probably a very good film, but unfortunately, measuring up against his other works, it didn't shine as bright as I would.
I think it's going to be very interesting as we go further back and you realize how little money that he had and what he could do. I think this is a good benchmark in terms of where his pre Hollywood output and before he got the money, kind of what he was able to do, for instance, and the way that he kind of matured in terms of his craft and whatever else in terms of how experimental it could be, and when he kind of just did things for a paycheck or whatever way it was. Unfortunately, no color to talk about this film. Not much to talk about in terms of costumes because they have pretty much one costume for most of the movie, apart from a little bit of negligee that was in there and our maid's outfit. But so nothing like that to compare against the other films. But I'm glad we went back here, and we'll have to have a discussion and see where we go next. I'll certainly put it in the comments when we'll publish a video about what's up next, and see where we go next on our Hitchcock journey. If anybody wanted to find you, Jane, where would they find you with your newly
So,
heavy output that you're doing these days, which is very great to see?
well, thank you. So I am Lady Jane Books, and you can find me on BookTube at Lady Jane Books. I specialize in horror, creepy, thriller books, horror books, that type of thing. And I'm also available on Instagram at Lady Jane Books.
Excellent. I put the links down in the description as normal, and we'll see you probably next month for another Hitchcock discussion. And one to look forward to. If any suggestions, of course, put them down in the comments. Or if you've seen Lady Vanishes and think we're both full of crap, then that's more than welcome to have that discussion down there. All right, take care, and I'll speak to you all again soon.